Welcome to our final event of this year at the Humanities Institute, which is the best event of the year, I think we could say, in that it represents our student fellows' presentations and the culmination of their work for the last year. Most of you know, my name is Patricia Berry. I'm an associate professor of history and also the associate director for the Humanities Institute. Spring is always a very busy time of year, and this part of the spring particularly, you'll probably see that reflected in a certain number of people coming and going as they scuttle out to other events. First of all, this is quite informal, so please feel free to get up and get some snacks or nosh as we proceed. But, you know, in the midst of all the hubbub of the spring, there are always a few events that are particularly meaningful and really at the heart of what we do. And I'm a historian, so I always have an eye toward the past in particular, and an eye toward the sort of issues related to time in general. And so in the late spring here at Fairfield, I always reflect on what universities were in their origins, how they began, and what they still are as linked to that. On the one hand, they're rather universities as places are these little mini fiefdoms full of bureaucrats and administrative procedures and offices and all sorts of building, which is quite evident as you look out of these nice windows today. But at the heart of that process, at the heart of every university, is precisely what was always at the heart of universities from their first inception, and that is the relationship between professors and students. Our event today is at its core a pure expression of that relationship. And it's also important in a way that our student scholars may not be quite aware, because they are standing, in fact, at the moment where they cease to be our students and they become our peers. So this is also a welcome to them into that circle of scholars. As usual, we need to say a few thanks first to various people behind the scenes who have helped to make today possible. First of all, I'd like to thank Acting Provost Christine Siegel and Acting President Lynn Babington, who may be popping in during the course of our day today for their support of the Humanities Institute. I think it's appropriate for us also to acknowledge the National Endowment for the Humanities, which is responsible for our original grant, and in connection to that, to thank the political leaders and citizens who saw through their support of the National Endowment of the Humanities how critical the humanities are to a healthy society. We also need to thank, of course, others, and I said behind the scenes, but it hardly applies to the next person we need to thank, which is Elizabeth Hastings, because we don't allow her to go behind the scenes. We keep her far too busy doing all the things that are necessary, not only for this event, but for all of the events that take place under the auspices of the Humanities Institute all year. So thank you very much to Elizabeth. And finally, I'll offer brief thanks now, and perhaps more fulsome thanks after our students have given their presentations, to our director of the Humanities Institute, Ron Davidson, and I'm going to turn the mic over to him to say a few opening remarks. So Ron, take it away.
Thank you, Patricia. Good afternoon. For those who don't know me, I'm Ron Davidson, the director of the Humanities Institute and the director of the School of the Humanities. I do want to thank you all for coming out this afternoon. I'm very excited about the Humanities Seminar student fellows presenting the results of their research to the university faculty, students, staff, and friends. The faculty fellows presented their work on March 9th of this semester, and our faculty fellows are seated right down here in a front table, as they should. And now it is the students' turns. The Humanities Seminar was created out of a 2011 initiative that was put together by Dr. Catherine Schwab and myself, and which I brought to the chairs of the humanities departments, and then to the dean of the college, Robin Crabtree, and Father Paul Fitzgerald, Senior Vice President for Academic Affairs at the time. That initiative precipitated a rethinking of the Humanities Institute, which had until then been a line item entry in the dean's budget. Formalized into a faculty-driven summer and fall series of meetings in 2012, in which approximately 10 faculty met on a regular basis to formulate a new vision for the Humanities Institute. The call was put out in 2014 for the inaugural director, and I was anointed First Wizard Deluxe of Oz. Dr. Sarah Brill was appointed the Associate Director in charge of the Humanities Seminar, and together with Dr. Nels Pearson, we formulated and executed a plan. In February of 2015, the call was issued for applications for the inaugural cohort of faculty fellows to the Humanities Seminar, and in May 2015, the inaugural student fellows were selected, and they worked together for the faculty on that first year. A primary goal of the student-faculty seminar was to be able to develop humanities students so that they understood what would be expected of them were they were to continue on with the graduate or professional work in the humanities. This is more common in other disciplines, but the humanities have been lagging in its duty. Last spring, again, a call was put out for a new cohort of student fellows, and the panel before you were selected. An exception was made in the case of Angela Semarone, who is going on to graduate studies here at Fairfield, but who wished to continue her work with Dr. Emily Orlando. Since we were loath to break up that pairing, we changed the rules to allow her to continue. Each of these students has worked with a faculty mentor for the last year, learning research at the professional level, then formulating their own projects, a summary of which you will hear this afternoon. I want to thank our Associate Director for the seminar over this past year, Dr. Patricia Berry, whose instincts have been spectacular and who has been a joy to work with. I also want to thank Dr. Nels Pearson, who has been both my right hand from the beginning in executing the Humanities Institute and who is the incoming director of the Humanities Institute as of July 1. I would also like to thank Dr. Christine Siegel for allowing us to expand the Humanities Seminar for next year, so that we will have 6 faculty fellows working in concert with 8 student fellows over the course of the year. Finally, I wish to acknowledge the special efforts of Mrs. Mara Dutoit, our graduate assistant this semester, who has been putting in yeoman service for keeping track of the students and who is apparently a glutton for punishment as she will continue on with the Humanities Seminar next year. Thank you very much.
Okay, our first student presenter is Ms. Riham Majeed, who has been working under the supervision of Professor Chris Seeley. Riham is a senior graduating this year with a double major in art history and psychology, and with minors in Black Studies and studio art. She is hoping in the future to go on to graduate school, particularly in museum studies. And she was our first presenter to give us her research, Black Artists in the Art Historical Canon, Conflicts Between Assimilation and Essentialism. Riham.
Hello, everyone. Okay, so my project is Black Artists in the Art Historical Canon, Conflicts Between Assimilation and Essentialism. So I'll start with talking about the art historical canon. The first discourse on Western European art, written by Giorgio Vasari, is the framework that sets the art historical canon. Vasari establishes the artist as a certain type of person, one who is socially free. A socially free person in 16th century Italy is a person whose class status allows them to become an artist. A socially free person is one whose gender does not restrict them from being an artist, or one whose race does not deem them inferior, therefore a white upper-class male. Both Vasari's Lives and a more modern text like Jensen's History of Art organize the quality of art through the norm of encompassing classical qualities, ones that resemble the quote-unquote high art of the Greeks and Romans. So Vasari also establishes this myth of the artist construct. He describes great artists through this biographical approach and establishes that what makes the art great is the individualistic characteristics and life of the artist rather than the social and political forces that pull them. The artist is then placed in a box. What makes an artist great is their personal characteristics, fueling a trope like the tortured or isolated artist. The genius of the artist can be determined by his life, since they are a product of such life, and the art historian is the one who wields the power to determine legitimacy of a genius artist. So attempts to canonize the African American art, this framework was created for upper-class white men, and it occurs in two ways that I labeled. Essentialist view, it abandons Eurocentric ingrained framework for one that better suits the uniqueness of African American experience. And the assimilation view is when assimilating in order to be considered equal to white counterparts. So Du Bois uses the concept of a common ideal as a point of union for the Black race. He says, and I quote, "For the development of the Negro genius, of Negro literature and art, of Negro spirit, only Negroes bound and wielded together." Du Bois believes African American artists are creating art based on their identity that is being gazed upon in order to please white patrons. He finds aesthetics to be irrelevant and decadent because it ignores issues of justice. Aesthetic radicalism, defined by the Black Power movement of the 1960s and 70s, seeks to embody mass culture while rejecting Eurocentric notions of cultural production. The Black Arts movement, which coincides with the Black Power movement, incorporates Black nationalism in order to distinguish the Black identity from the restricting confines of the art historical canon. Alain Locke defines Black art as racial in origin and spiritual incubation, but interracial in consumption and effect. The New Negro presents the Black artist as a cosmopolitan. He views the New Negro as one who takes pride in his roots while also appealing to American qualities. He believed in the vindication of Negro art should come largely at the hands of the white American artist. In a way, this presents a form of assimilation by suggesting that the New Negro artist should be accepted by the white mainstream. Ancestral art, as defined by Locke, is the use of African motifs in the New Negro's art as an embrace of their identity. However, he notes that the success of ancestral art is not only a result of African Americans embracing African art, but also Europeans like Picasso and Matisse embracing African art. So OBAC, or the Organization of Black American Culture, is an artist collective who, like Du Bois, wanted to create a union within Black communities. Pictured here is a mural, not in the context of an institution, but on a public building in Chicago, illustrating the underrepresented Black figures. They created art for the public in order to distinguish a Black identity, therefore embodying an essentialist view. Aaron Douglas references Afrocentric imagery. While embracing his American identity, his modernist embrace of Western abstraction is seen in two-dimensional forms, as well as his acknowledgement of the New Negro with imagery referencing Egyptian motifs. Despite using Afrocentric imagery, his embrace of European abstract styles at the time perpetuated a sense of conformity, since white patrons embraced this quote-unquote New Negro aesthetic. So finding a middle ground. Walter Mignolo seeks to decolonialize thinking and hegemonies that place frameworks like Vasari's as the standard. In order to reconstruct the art historical canon, one must not completely reject art historical notions like the essentialist view, but one must not completely assimilate either. While universality is always imperial, according to Mignolo, I choose to take from Mignolo's concept of pluriversal and applying it to aesthetics, so that one must think of aesthetics as many different constructs and standards that fit identities rather than one that limits and confines. So an example of this middle ground, one would be David Hammond's. His elusiveness counters the effort to define the artist by his biography, but rather just by his work. He's rarely exhibited, rarely interviewed, and he leaves his work to speak for himself. In Orange is the New Black, he paints a commercially distributed African sculpture orange to suggest the mass incarceration of African Americans. Barbara Chase Rybound calls this work an anti-form. She uses extremely abstract forms to suggest Black femininity, a subject that has been rarely touched upon in the art historical canon. She suggests the body with this figural form while also depicting Black female hair with the cords, translating her work into a depiction of the Black beauty. Other examples include Glenn Ligon and his use of text, which proposes a new way to view identity. In I Do Not Always Feel Colored, he borrows words from a 1928 Zora Neale Hurston essay in order to suggest that race is a social construct. The words eventually blur to make the words cast shadows, bleed into one another, so that their meaning seems less fixed. His expressive implementation of text suggests a new way to view identity. And finally, Elizabeth Catlett has said that the purpose of her art is to present Black people in their beauty and dignity for ourselves and others to understand and enjoy. She blends figurative and abstract traditions with her own social concerns. While she makes her art for African Americans, she maintained a deep belief in the democratic power of printed art to reach a larger audience. In this particular piece, she expresses her enthusiasm in Malcolm X's success in inspiring Black women. That's it.
Thank you, Riham. Our next presenter is John McGovern, who worked this year with Dr. Ron Davidson. John is a senior also, and he has a major in biochemistry with minors in philosophy and classical studies. He'll be moving to Boston next year and is going to be figuring out how to put these multiple skills to work at that time. John joins us to present his research, Character Change and the Soul, Reconciling Aristotle's Ethics with Post-Aristotelian Cultural Perspectives.
All right, so this is going to be the fun one. As was said, my project title is Character Change and the Soul, Reconciling Aristotle's Ethics with Post-Aristotelian Cultural Perspectives. So my thesis of this was that Aristotle, in his Nicomachean Ethics, argues that rapid character change is not possible because it requires this long-term habituation in order to instigate true character change. But on the other hand, Christianity promotes this plausibility of rapid character change in things like conversion events and stuff like that. But ultimately, I think that the Aristotelian view can be reconciled with the Christian perspective through an understanding of the transformative qualities of a virtue Aristotle calls practical judgment. So in his Nicomachean Ethics and On the Soul, he breaks down the soul into two parts. There's the rational half and there's the irrational half. They are both broken down further into four total, with there being a knowing and calculating half on the rational side. Knowing being about things that you know that do not change, things like scientific constants. The calculating half being about things you can change, things you can deliberate about with reason. And then on the other side, there's the nutritive soul, which is about growth, and he doesn't spend much time talking about that in the Nicomachean Ethics, and the appetitive soul, which is about desire and pleasure. Now, what's very interesting about his dynamic between these parts of the soul is that the appetitive part of the irrational soul can obey the rational side of the soul. It can obey reason. And from this, there is a balance between the two parts of the soul. There is a certain amount of moderation that can occur between those two things. And from that, we arrive at two very distinct things, which is virtuosity and viciousness. So when Aristotle talks about virtues, he splits those in two as well, with there being virtues of intellect from the rational part of the soul and virtues of character from the irrational part of the soul. And both of these, according to him, are arrived at through habituation. We're talking about repetition of actions, repetition of virtuous deeds, and practicing these deeds as a virtuous person would in order to achieve it. So through this habituation, you can either become virtuous or vicious, and this virtue is a mean between two extremes, and those two extremes are what he calls vices. For example, with the virtue of courage, you have the extremes of cowardice and rashness, with courage being the virtue and rashness and cowardice being the vices. And to Aristotle, the habituation in order to arrive at these ends takes a long period of time with the repetition constantly of these virtuous actions. So this habituation is not completely mindless. It requires a moral eye, in a sense. And he finds this moral eye in the intellectual virtue of practical judgment. Now, he spends about 10 pages discussing practical judgment, and I've confined it to about 2 sentences. So basically what he calls practical judgment, it's a moral sense. It allows you to see what situations are moral situations and what you should do in these situations. And it's fueled by an accumulation of experiences. For example, say you make a mistake, you hurt a friend of yours, the friend tells you, you hurt me, and you decide to make a change. That change is processed through practical judgment, through that experience of being told about it and wanting to change yourself. So this accumulation of experiences can tune the virtue of practical judgment to the proper judgment. And this development of practical judgment through experience emphasizes the amount of time needed in order to attain virtuosity, in that you need a large accumulation of experiences in order to ever have the proper judgment. So there's lots of conflicting views about this long-term habituation, especially in Western literature, where there are many stories of characters that do not go under this long-term change. They go under very short-term change. One example is from the ancient Greek tradition. There's the character Hecuba, who's the queen of Troy, whose children get brutally murdered by a traitor, and she decides to change her ways from this dignified character to feeding the traitor his children. So we go from a very dignified royal queen to someone who feeds someone his children. So that's a big difference. There's also other characters, like in Shakespeare's play Timon of Athens, when Timon turns from a philanthropist to a misanthrope across a series of events that occurs to him. And I think the best example of this is Scrooge from A Christmas Carol. And I think fiction is not enough to talk about, because there are religious teachings that it impacts real life. It's a real thing, it's a reality in these religious traditions, and most especially in Christianity, I think, which is based significantly upon conversion experiences and the ability to convert over a short period of time through Jesus' preachings. And I think a very good example of this is St. Paul of Tarsus, who goes from persecuting Christians to becoming a Christian himself over a rather short period of time. And this is not to say that this character change is easy or common, but that the fact that this is part of these stories and it's treated so seriously means that we believe that there is some possibility within them that this is possible. So Aristotle first really came into the Christian scene through St. Thomas Aquinas, who was influenced by the ethics and brought Aristotle's philosophical arguments from other things as well into the Christian theology as a language of argumentation. And we also see in Christianity a lot of commonality between Aristotle's virtues and the virtues of Christianity. Both have virtues being means between extreme behaviors, both emphasize a sense of moderation, and both focus greatly on a human community. And also today, I would say the way we consider virtues is very similar to the way Aristotle considers virtues. Think of how we perceive things like courage and that it is lying between the extremes of cowardice and rashness. And so these two views are in disagreement, and Aristotle's claims are going against many fundamental stories of both Christianity and other religions. And simultaneously, it disagrees with an institution which he greatly influenced. But I think that despite this reconciliation between the two views of rapid character change, reconciliation is possible. One could simply argue that the validity of these conversions is questionable, but that doesn't truly reconcile the two views. And I think that it is possible to reconcile them through what I talked about before, practical judgment. So it's a virtue which is affected by experience, and I think that as is evidenced by the literary characters and the biblical characters, there's a sudden shock that occurs to the characters, an external shock that shakes up their worldview and essentially forces the virtue of practical judgment to shift its focus from one view of the world to another, providing a different sort of eye to view these situations, tuning the virtues that one has to the new worldview due to that shocking experience. So this obviously occurs over a very short period of time, but conversion still seems to remain an unlikely event, as plausible as it may be, because the intensity of the shock required to do this and the possibility of being completely instantaneous in a sense is rather unlikely. But because of this reconciliation, it is at least possible that someone could undergo this rapid character change. So in the end, I conclude that the Christian and Aristotelian views of rapid character change can be reconciled through this understanding of the transformative and experiential qualities of the virtue of practical judgment. And that's it.
Thank you, John. Our next presenter is Michelle Rakowski, who worked this year under the supervision of Dr. Marianne Carolyn. Michelle is a senior, graduating with a major in art history and theater, and with minors in women, gender, and sexuality studies and Italian. And next year, she will be holding an internship at the Peggy Guggenheim Museum in Venice, a pursuit which I think maybe 95% of the room is extremely jealous about. Michelle will be presenting her research to us, Exploring the Female Gaze, the Subject of the Female Body.
Hello, I'm just going to take a second to put in my PowerPoint. Okay, thank you. I was like, that's not good. Okay. Okay, I see. Okay, so as what was previously said, my topic is exploring the female gaze, the subject of the female body. So the research question I sort of started with was, how do female artists convey and explore the female body? I landed on this sort of simply because most of the art historical canon is composed of male artists, therefore all of the images of women and their bodies are from male artists. So to change that conversation, I wanted to see what female artists were creating nowadays. And this is my thesis. To continue to repair the unequal representation of female artists in the art world and the historical canon, I will explore how 3 contemporary female artists, Marilyn Minter, Marina Abramovic, and Emma Amos, portray and explore the female body in their art. Thus, these female artists, by portraying women's bodies, contribute to the female gaze because they are creating the female perspective through their art and yielding visual representations of womanhood. So first I wanted to talk about the Guerrilla Girls, who are one of the earliest, most outspoken criticizers of female representation in the art world and the canon. They're a group of feminist activist artists who are anonymous by the gorilla masks that they wear, and they focus on issues that they criticize the art world for, and their activism takes the form of outrageous visuals, often posters, to expose gender and ethnic bias. So with this poster, it poses the question, do women have to be naked to get in the Met Museum? And they respond with the statistic that they collected that less than 5% of the artists in the modern art sections are women, but 85% of these nudes are female. This is from the early 1980s, this poster. And so basically this poster, I think, draws the conclusion that in the art historical canon, women are valued as objects to be portrayed, but not for their creations of what to see. So then Linda Nochlin posed this question in her essay of the same title in 1971, why have there been no great women artists? And this kind of sparked feminist art criticism in 1971 in the United States, and she gives 2 answers to these questions. So the first one is that women have been discriminated against historically, and therefore they've had a very difficult time training as artists. Nochlin credits the women who have been able to become artists, even with the obstacles that they have faced. For example, women weren't allowed to study the nude model, which was essential for training as an artist. And then the second answer that she gives is that the way that art historians define greatness excludes women artists. And she goes on to say that men are not born with a better ability to create art compared to women, but they have had more opportunities to fulfill the culturally determined requirements for artistic genius. And then to give a little background of feminist art history, the purpose for it is essentially to study women as artists, patrons, viewers, and subjects. And through this, to understand or develop the idea of femininity, or what it means to be a woman. And then also how, when looking at art, how representations of women in art are affected by gender and gender ideologies in society. And then through feminist art history, it does sort of change what art historians have been looking at. So you start to focus on the female figure, the gaze of the viewer, like who is expected to be looking at this painting or piece of art, and then the social construction of femininity. And essentially, the subject of the female body is a combination of the construction of gender and the presence in society. So it gets really complicated, and how the female body is displayed really depends on who's creating it. So then one of the things that's essential to know that's a feminist art historical critique is the male gaze. So essentially the male gaze is the way in which visual art depicts the world and women from a masculine point of view. So what happens from the male gaze, the female body becomes an object, and then women are presented as objects for male pleasure. And basically then when looking at women's bodies, it becomes an expression and assertion of patriarchal values when it's done by a male artist. And then John Berger, who's a novelist, poet, and art critic, basically sums it up with his quote, "She is as naked as the spectator sees her." So what the woman is and her nudity is for male pleasure and for their perspective. And then he also continues to talk about that women and men become inherently different in the way they're depicted visually in art. And so the effect of the male gaze changes how women are perceived. And women are depicted in quite a different way from men, not because the feminine is different from the masculine, but because the ideal spectator is always assumed to be male, and the image of the woman is designed to flatter him. And essentially, the male gaze has limited the visual narrative of the female subject and the female body because they are created as objects of sight for the male viewer and not as essentially developed people. So one example of this that a lot of people are familiar with is the typical Renaissance nude. This is the Venus of Urbino by Titian in 1538. And the woman is laid out for the viewer to see, and a big indicator of her as an object is how she never really makes direct eye contact with the audience. So therefore, she's not aware of her viewer, but rather it's all about the viewer watching her. She's there and she exists to be seen. And then a further extension of the male gaze is scopophilia. And this is from an essay by Laura Mulvey, who was a feminist film critic. And she actually coined the phrase the male gaze in 1975. And she expands upon it in her essay, The Visual Pleasure and Narrative of Cinema. And she describes that one of the dangers of women only being seen through the male gaze as objects of sight is that the female subject not only is objectified, but then it's also sexualized and fetishized. And the definition of scopophilia is sexualizing hers and the female subject for male pleasure. And scopophilia is a specific type of pleasure that comes from looking. So it's getting pleasure from the viewer's gaze. And scopophilia subjects people to being objectified because they're also controlled by the gaze. And the fetishizing of women as subjects forms an identification process. So it teaches the viewer and it teaches people that they have the authority to gaze at women as objects, and thus that fetishizes them even further. And then in order to change this narrative, artists, particularly women artists, must explore what it is to portray women as individuals and not as objects of desire. And then to talk a little bit about the female gaze. So after hearing all that information, it's kind of like, okay, so how do female artists explore visually the experience of women and subvert the male gaze? How do they challenge centuries of male artists deciding how women should look in art? And then to define the female gaze, it's the visual arts depicting the world and women from a female point of view. So then the purpose of the female gaze is that it will enable women to artistically and critically explore how women exist in society and understands what it means to be a woman. And when female artists have the opportunity to investigate their own perspective through art, this should diversify how women have been portrayed in art. So this is the first artist I was looking at, Marilyn Minter. She was born in 1948 and is a painter and photographer. And she really explores the female body, particularly through the fashion and beauty industries and their expectations. Okay. So the first one is called Porn Grid from 1989. And when this first came out, it was very controversial, and a lot of feminists condemned it for portraying women, because these are actually porn stills. So she took images from porn magazines, and that's what she based her paintings off of. So a lot of feminists really hated it. And it's made with enamel paint on metal. So this is a 4-panel grid of sex scenes from porn magazines. And Marilyn Minter is exploring how women are objectified for sexual pleasure of the viewer, especially male sexual domination. Because a big critique of porn is how it's real women, but they're limited by the definition and purpose of pornography. So again, it's further objectifying women for male sexual pleasure. So when Marilyn Minter created this piece, she cropped the images and embellished them with a lot of suggestive paint, splash, and drips. And because of the enamel on metal, it provides a really nice, smooth and glossy finish, which adds kind of a sensual, like alluring quality when you're looking at them. And basically what she's doing through this work is reclaiming a subject that typically degrades women by making these images her own and no longer solely for the male viewer. And this is another painting she has called Blue Poles from 2007. And with this work in particular, she's exploring fashion and beauty through this very stylized composition. And so she's zooming in on the realities and imperfections of the model's face. You can see every pimple, freckle, hair follicle, and piece of glitter. So it's a very hyper-realistic painting. And typically, like, when you see women in advertisements and they're sexualized, you're often seeing sections of their body and not their whole being, which is another indicator of women being objectified. So she's sort of taking that on through this. And the imperfections of the human body are contrasted with this like beautiful, shimmering blue eyeshadow. So it shows this dichotomy of expectations of what people want women's bodies to be, and then the reality and what are we supposed to be hiding or what are we allowed to show. And the painting's title is also an allusion to Jackson Pollock's Blue Poles from 1952, and it's one of his drip painting canvases, and the composition's interrupted by poles that pierce it. And I think that's similar to what Minter's doing in her painting with the blue eyeshadow, how it kind of grabs your attention and pierces the model's face. But then you kind of end up being drawn to all the other imperfections that are happening on the canvas. And the next artist I was looking at is Marina Abramovic. She was born in 1946 in Belgrade, Yugoslavia, and she's a performance artist. So the first piece is called Rhythm Zero from 1974. And this one really tested the limits of the relationship between the performer and the audience. And Abramovic doesn't identify as a feminist. She considers herself an artist, which doesn't have a gender because she doesn't want to be limited by that. But obviously her body is her medium. So she does, a lot of commentary ends up coming out of it about her female body and how she uses it. So for this piece, she actually put 72 objects on a table, and for 6 hours, everyone was allowed to come in and use any of the objects to her that she wanted. And on the instructions, she actually put, "I am the object." So through this, she's objectifying herself and allowing the audience to use whatever they would like. Some of the objects were a rose, feather, honey, a whip, olive oil. There was a gun with a single bullet, and it really tested the human subject and how aggressive and vulnerable people can be when they're hidden from social consequences. And she found that a lot of the things that were done to her kind of portrayed the Madonna or the whore. People were more nicer or gentler to her, or some other things that happened was her clothes were cut up. She was caused to bleed by the thorns of the rose, and actually the gun was pointed at her. So it kind of exploring what it looks like for a woman to allow herself to be objectified. And then this piece is called Role Exchange from 1975. And what Abramovic did was when she was in Amsterdam and traded places with a prostitute who'd been working there for 10 years, about the same amount of time that she'd been working as a professional artist. And they trade places for 4 hours. So Abramovic was in the window where the prostitute worked, and then the prostitute pretended to be her at an art gallery opening. So through this, she's really exploring identity, womanhood, and also by her being in the window, how that's the private space for the prostitute, but then you have the public gazing on you and walking by just on the other side of the door. And the last artist I'm investigating is Emma Amos. She was born in Atlanta, Georgia in 1938. And Emma Amos is an intersectional artist who explores race and gender as an African-American woman. And both of these are essential with how she creates her art and how the audience perceives it. But in the context of my research, I am focusing more so on how she critically examines gender. And a lot of her art uses a premise of double consciousness. So she has this kind of fractured sense of identity in her art, and she chooses to embrace this in order so she doesn't get identities imposed upon her. And this piece is called Worksuit from 1994. It's acrylic on linen, canvas, and a photo transfer, and it investigates art historical representations of race and gender that African-American women face sexist in addition to racist objectification. And so what she's doing here is she's clothing herself in the body of a white male artist, and it's actually from British painter Lucian Freud's painter working reflection. So she puts his body on hers, and by doing this, it signifies art world privilege, and she acknowledges the source of her own creativity with the floating hands that are around her body. And then the last piece is called Measuring from 1995, and it's also acrylic on linen, photo transfers, and African strip woven borders with photography. And Amos incorporates photo transfers of appropriated art historical icons that represent Eurocentric ideals of beauty. And this one also has hands in the corner of the paintings. And this marks the presence of the artist who takes the measure of measuring. So what's meant by that is it calls inadequacy to the Eurocentric standards of beauty for those whose physique or skin color does not measure up. So she's criticizing how African American women are also held to standards of womanhood that don't quite work for them. And that's it for my presentation. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Michelle. Our next presenter is Angela Samarone, who has worked now for 2 years with Dr. Emily Orlando, as Ron mentioned. Angela is now a graduate student, getting a master's in English education here at Fairfield, and her work with the Humanities Institute last year and her collaboration with Dr. Orlando led her to present her research at the Edith Wharton Society annual meeting, and she won an award for last year's research. So she came back to us for another year. Last year she graduated from Fairfield with a major in English and minors in education studies, women, gender, and sexuality studies, and digital journalism. And in the near future, she'll be leaving our campus to apply for teaching jobs in New Jersey for grades 7 through 12. So, Angela. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to mention her title. The title of Angela's research for us this year is On the Threshold She Paused, Doors in Edith Wharton's The Decoration of Houses and the Mother's Recompense.
Oh, it's all good.
Which book is it?
It's this one.
Maybe not. Okay. So we're just gonna. Well, second time is always the charm. Okay. Okay. Hi, thank you for coming and thank you for that introduction. So I'm Angela Samarone. As mentioned, this is my second time around the block with the Humanities Institute seminar. My experience for my second year was somewhat different than it was my first year. I will be presenting on the topic that I had researched and developed last year, but since then you will see that it has undergone quite a transformation. And so I'll start my presentation by talking about my paper, some of the revisions, but also some of its history, and then kind of move forward with the opportunities that the Humanities seminar has offered me right after in early as June and up until this point. So the title of my paper, On the Threshold She Paused, Doors in Edith Wharton's The Decoration of Houses and the Mother's Recompense, began with a question inspired by Dr. Orlando's research of how does Edith Wharton use interior design and architecture to represent women in her fiction. And so let me begin by showing you Edith Wharton herself. Her dates 1862 to 1937, her lovely photo there, and a synopsis of the two texts that I used to write my paper. So on the left, beginning with The Decoration of Houses, written in 1897. So this is her design manual that she co-writes with Boston architect Obman Common Jr., where she denounces Victorian-style architecture and interior design, its opulence and its gaudiness, and she calls for simplistic kind of architectural principles of balance and symmetry and proportion. And so the first part of my paper is kind of looking at what part of interior design and architecture can I look at and then apply to one of her many pieces of fiction that she writes. And so I look at the less well-read and well-known, The Mother's Recompense, and towards the end of her life in 1925, it's one of her last novels-ish. It's kind of at the end of her writing career, where I'm going to give you a quick overview where she has Kate Clephane is her protagonist, who's in her mid-40s, Anne Clephane, her daughter, in her 20s, and Chris Fenno, who's in his mid-20s, 30s, and he is the fiance of Anne, but also the ex-lover of Kate. So I just spoiled the book for you, and I apologize. But that is the premise of the novel, is this love triangle that by no means is conventional of sorts, and so becomes complicated when Kate, who's living away in France, is asked to return to New York from her daughter, and when she comes face to face with Chris once again. And she has the dilemma that she now has to solve of whether or not she should reveal her secret to her daughter. And so my thesis for my paper is nothing like how it was this time a year ago. Spending time with Kate, literally reading her over and over again, has led me to believe that, what I thought who she was is not who she is anymore. And so I begin with choosing that piece of interior design and architecture, and that piece is the space of the doorway, the threshold. And that's the location where I argue that Kate, whenever she's standing on it, she actually experiences a shift from the beginning of the novel to the end, where she begins as a selfish woman who's always making decisions for herself and becomes increasingly self-sacrificing for her daughter. And that, I argue, is mirroring that purpose of Doors, because she's very exclusive in her decisions when she's selfish, and now she's becoming inclusive when thinking about somebody else other than herself, when she starts to sacrifice something that may be important to her for her daughter's sake. And interestingly enough, that happens on the threshold, but not when she is alone. It's actually through interactions with men like Chris Fenno himself, a family friend, Fred Landers, and the bishop, Dr. Arklow, that she begins to understand this mother's recompense, something that she didn't really kind of acknowledge she even had before, and nodding to the title of the book there. So by the end, I argue that, Kate, she kind of transcends the threshold, and she sacrifices her happiness for her daughter's happiness, but she's okay with that. So my paper, how it was organized, began with one section on Wharton and interior design. So talking about her and Cobbin's relationship, writing the decoration of houses, her background in interior design, how this decoration of houses was received by critics. But what came out of that section was really her understanding of privacy. So there's this quote from Decoration of Houses where she calls privacy one of the first requisites of civilized life, and that's something that still stays true to my thesis even now, because Kate is all about her privacy and wants to be selfish and keep things to herself, and so does Wharton. But as Kate finds out, it's not always that easy to be private but then please others. And so section 2 moves more into interior design in Wharton's fiction. So interior design and architecture more generally really are important to Wharton, and you see that in all of her novels. So I argue that the threshold is among those spaces. And there's a critic, Stevenson, who calls the threshold a transformative space, and I agree, and extend that to the mother's recompense, because it's on there that Kate herself undergoes a transformation, and the threshold being a liminal space between the inside and the outside of a room. It's mirroring the transition that she's feeling from, as an identity of probably a single woman, kind of reclaiming her identity as a mother again. And then section 3 moved into Doors, more specifically in the mother's recompense, and what was previously argued about an ideology that condemned Kate for feeling sexual has now transformed into a focus more on the mother's recompense itself. So you'll see that there has been a growth in my understanding of focusing more on Kate's reclaiming of her identity as mother and less on her identity as a woman. And so now, 1 year later, where has all of this work taken me? So to begin, we are time traveling back to June of 2016, and I had the opportunity, because of the Humanities Institute seminar, to attend my very first conference for the Edith Wharton Society in Washington, D.C. with Dr. Orlando, who was president of the Edith Wharton Society of the time. And so I was really privileged to be able to present with 9 other undergraduates who were in attendance on a panel of 3 of us who were able to kind of share our research, my panel specifically on mobility, motion, and space, and be able to kind of confer and network with other people in my research. And so what have I been doing for the past year? Well, I had the opportunity to decide that I wanted to take this paper and I wanted it to bring it to other people's eyes. And so I decided that this paper would get published, and I resolved that that was what I wanted to do. And with Dr. Orlando's guidance and the support of the Humanities Institute seminar, I was able to revisit my paper and prepare it for publication. I submitted an article-length version of it to the Edith Wharton Review, a peer-reviewed journal published with Penn State University Press, and am happy to report that I had received 2 double-blind peer-reviewed responses to give me feedback, and was given the go-ahead with a revise and resubmit of looking at my paper and be able to resubmit it due next week. So hopefully we will see. So there's a cliffhanger for you to where that's going to be. Maybe in the journal, maybe not. But it wouldn't have gone this far without the help of the Humanities Institute seminar. And so I end my presentation with hearty thanks to everybody in this room for supporting students like me, for being able to be a scholar in training. And it wouldn't have been possible without the opportunity to work with Dr. Orlando and be able to work with students such as the ones on this panel to confer and share ideas. So thank you.
That's great. Thank you, Angela. Our last presenter is Kelsey Sullivan, who spent this year under the supervision of Dr. Shannon Kelly. Kelsey is also a senior, graduating in less than a month. She is a major in English and creative writing, and she has a minor in women, gender, and sexuality studies. Most immediately after she leaves Fairfield, she'll be on a service trip to Ecuador, and her hope in the future is to be working in the publishing field. She's sharing her research with us today, titled Reanimating Daphne, The Emergence of Daphne's Myth in Contemporary American Women's Poetry and Instances of Sexual Assault.
Okay, hi everyone. Like Professor Barry said, my project is titled Reanimating Daphne, The Emergence of Daphne's Myth in Contemporary American Women's Poetry and Sexual Assault Cases. So this is my thesis. In my research, I found that the myth of Daphne and Apollo to be exceedingly important in modern literature, for it dictates how we perceive sexual pursuit and sexual assault as it pertains to an unwanted touch, a common occurrence for women of all ages. Given our contemporary culture of increasing violence against women, today's readers should return once again to myths of origin to critique and challenge the way love, gender, and sexuality are presented. By reviewing Daphne's iconic story and her legacy for 20th century poets and writers, I argue that her transformation into the laurel tree should be seen as proof of the inherently detrimental effects of unwanted touch. Victims of unwanted touch lose their voice and are viewed as nothing more than physical bodies. But regaining what was lost is achievable, as a number of female poets use the story of Daphne to describe how to rebuild what was destroyed by the assault. By focusing on video and textual evidence from both Donald Trump's 2016 groping scandal and the reaction on social media, I show once again how women's bodies are subjected to male desires, sexual violation, and unwanted touch. At the same time, the feminist Twitter response produced a conversation about physical groping, which otherwise does not get as much attention as genital rape. Daphne's experience then is at the center of a historic presidential campaign that divided a nation. So this is Daphne, one of her many representations in art. In the famous myth, Daphne is a beautiful nymph and the daughter of the river god Peneus. Apollo is the god of sun and music. Cupid strikes Daphne with an arrow of flight and Apollo with an arrow of love. Apollo then pursues Daphne, even though she is physically running from him and has no interest in marrying, as she prays to remain a virgin forever. Eventually, Daphne cannot run anymore, and Apollo catches up with her. She prays to her father for help. As Apollo catches her and tries to grab her, she transforms into the laurel tree. Her prayer was scarcely finished when she feels a torpor take possession of her limbs. Her supple trunk is girdled with a thin layer of fine bark over her smooth skin. Her hair turns to foliage, her arms grow into branches. Sluggish root adhere to feet that were so recently swift, her head becomes the summit of a tree. In this story, Daphne is viewed by Apollo as a body to be violated, not a woman to be loved. The effects of Apollo's unwanted touch cause Daphne to lose everything from her physical body to her voice. There are many female poets who have taken on the subject of Daphne and embodied her in their poems. By doing this, they are giving Daphne her voice back, just a piece of what was taken from her, but they are also embodying the trauma that victims of sexual assault go through. They are also exploiting the assaulting nature of Apollo. So this is one of the first poems. It's entitled Daphne by Alicia E. Stallings. Stallings is writing directly from Daphne's point of view. The end of the poem, which is highlighted in red over there, is extremely significant because it shows that Daphne's desires matter as a laurel tree, even if they didn't when she was a woman. It shows Daphne having strength as a woman, as a laurel. Stallings writes, I may give in, I do not lose. Your hot stare cannot stop my shivering with delight if I so choose. And my next poem is, this one's a little bit longer, sorry, but it's called Where I Live in This Honorable House of the Laurel Tree, and it's by Anne Sexton. And in this poem, Sexton embodies the pain and anger that Daphne feels towards Apollo, as well as the honor she does feel being a laurel tree. So two important passages that are highlighted in red are, I am a fist of my unease as I spill towards the stars in the empty years, and then claiming that you gave me honor too soon, Apollo. Laurie Halse Anderson also embodies Daphne in her young adult novel Speak, which is pictured up here. In Speak, the main character, freshman Melinda, is raped by an older boy on the football team. And she is so traumatized that she actually loses her voice. But through the course of the book and an art project, Melinda is able to gain her voice back. And at the end of the book, the art project is this tree that she's been working on, which you can see on the cover, and that really is a nod to Daphne. And these themes of sexual violence against women and the loss of voice that comes from that are still present in our society today, as we can see in this video, which I am sure we are all familiar with, but we're going to just part of it.
Big phony tits and everything. She's totally changed her look.
Jeez, your girl's hot as shit. In the purple.
Whoa!
Yes!
Whoa!
Yes, the Donald has scored!
Whoa!
Oh, my man! Wait, you gotta look at me when you get out of your legs.
Sets this up.
That is very.
You give me the thumbs
Look
up.
at you. You are a.
You gotta put the thumbs up. You gotta get the thumbs up.
Can't be too happy. First? Yeah, let me.
It's very
You
funny.
gotta give me the thumbs up.
All right, you and I will walk there.
Oh my god.
Maybe it's a different one.
Better not be the publicist. No, it's her. It's
Yeah, that's her with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. You know, I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. You just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything.
whatever you want.
Grab them by the pussy. I can do anything.
So this video obviously shows that sexual assault that is not genital rape seems to still be okay for people like Trump to commit. As we see in Daphne and Apollo, sexual violence really robs victims of their voices. A lot of these instances with Donald Trump were from as far back as the 70s, but victims did not feel comfortable to come forward until last year. However, the feminist response on social media shows that this is a very serious offense that happens more often than anyone would like to admit. Kelly Oxford tweeted this shortly after the video was released, and there was an extremely fruitful reaction from women using the Tweet Me Your First Assaults hashtag. I have found that these tweets, poems, novels, and stories all contribute to the greater discussion about sexual assault and how any form of unwanted touch has extremely damaging effects on the victims, just like it did for Daphne. Thank you.
Okay, well, the very first thing I will ask is if you will all join me in applauding the entire coterie of this year's cohorts of student fellows. Excellent work, excellent work. So we have reached the end of the formal portion of our event today, and we've reached the end of our journey together, this particular cohort of student and faculty fellows. Next year's cohort, in fact, will meet for the first time next week on May 3rd, and so if there are some of you in the audience, I welcome you into this circle of scholars. But as we started with some thanks, I'd like to end with some thanks. First, I wanted to make sure and mention someone who's been quite important to the work and progress of these students all year, and that is Matt Bernstein from the library, who has been an excellent liaison for these students, not only giving brief presentations to us as a group, but then holding their hands and giving them advice and helping them with their research all year. The final thanks, of course, belongs to Ron Davidson, and we'd like to make a special acknowledgement of his work. Ron not only has been an excellent director of the program, but he really is one of the most important voices in the restructuring of a more robust Humanities Institute in the past 2 years. You all know a great deal about Ron, or at least many of you, I suspect, do. You know him as an excellent scholar of Buddhism in East Asia, also as a supportive and encouraging colleague, and as a great friend. But what you may not know is that while he is, like a good humanities scholar, going off traveling as soon as he retires from this post in the summer, he's going to be off to Nepal, so a lot of travel in his future. There's some travel closer to home that he also engages in, and we're going to concentrate on that in offering him a parting gift. Ron is also, I just learned, a motorcycle enthusiast. And so as I set out to find an appropriate gift for a humanities scholar, of course, it had to be a book, but I thought it might be fun to find a book on motorcycles, since I suspect Ron will have at least a little bit of free time coming up for him. And so I rifled through titles, knowing nothing at all about motorcycles, and came across a nice photographic picture book called Indian Motorcycles. And I said, that's got to be the book for Ron, not knowing, of course, which he's probably thinking about in his head, that this does not refer to motorcycles in India. It's a particular brand of motorcycle called an Indian motorcycle, although I gather that motorcycles are quite popular in India, in fact, as well. So we've all signed a card, the student fellows and the faculty fellows and those of us who support the program in other ways, with a picture of a motorcycle and the following little inscription. Dear Ron, in thanks for your extraordinary work, redesigning, inspiring, and leading the new Humanities Institute, 2 books are headed your way: Indian Motorcycles, as mentioned, and The Build, How the Masters Design Custom Motorcycles. All the best for your well-earned sabbatical. And I will end by asking you to join me in thanking Ron Davidson. And now there's just the fun part. Please partake and speak with our wonderful student scholars and enjoy yourselves, and we will see you next year.